I mentioned the Cold War in another video, and because of mutually assured destruction, these two great powers, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, did not want to go to war directly. So, because they didn't want to go to war together directly, sometimes they had to get creative in how they fight. All right, so the United States' first approach to the Cold War is something called containment. This is sometimes called the Truman Doctrine, but it really should have been called the Marshall Doctrine because George Marshall was the guy who came up with it. He was Secretary of State under President Truman, and George Marshall was he was a great American. He's one of those people that he's done a lot of things that most people have never heard of his name. He planned D-Day, for example. He was the guy who planned most of the European theater, and then comes back and, Anyway, so he comes up with something called the Doctrine of Containment, and since Truman is the president, he gets to sign off on it, claim it. And containment was like, okay, you know what? We're not going to go to war with the Soviet Union. So we accept that socialism and communism are in all these places in Eastern Europe, plus a few places in Asia, but we're not going to let it spread either. We're not going to let it get bigger. And so we're willing to draw a line in the sand and say, you can stay on that side and we'll leave you alone. But if you try to step over this side, then we're going to slap you. And so that is going to get its first test in the country of Greece. Greece, after World War II, was a mess, as was most of Europe, and there's going to be a revolution going on. And the two sides of this revolution, one of them was being sponsored. It was a socialist group, a communist group. They wanted to be sponsored, and they were receiving aid from the Soviet Union. And so the United States said, you know what, we're not going to go to war over Greece. Great beaches, great music, cradle of civilization and all, but we don't want to go to war with a nuclear power over this. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to provide training and we're going to provide weapons and money to the other side. And this is called containment. And sometimes it gets mixed in with something called the domino effect. The idea is that if one country falls, then the countries, whatever countries border that country, are at risk of also becoming communists. For example, if Greece were to fall to communism, then that would put Turkey at risk. It would also put Italy at risk, and we don't want that to happen. And then if Italy were to fall to communism, that would put France or Austria. Austria was already communist, but that would put Switzerland, Spain, and put all these other countries at risk. The big problem with containment is that oftentimes we weren't real picky about who we sponsored. And so, for example, in Latin America, you had these leftist guerrillas, for example, the Sandinistas, and the Castro and his brother in the revolution in Cuba. And oftentimes, because they were not communist, we ended up supporting countries or regimes that were probably not organizations that we'd be real proud to, be seen with in any other situation. We see this, for example, in Chile. There is a person named Allende. And Allende is leftist. He is the democratically elected president of Chile, but he is communist, and we are uncomfortable with having a communist country forming in Latin America. And so we help Pinochet, his Colonel Pinochet, overthrow Allende. And Pinochet was a butcher. He was a horrible human being who is later going to be indicted on, I think, 50,000 counts of murder later in his life. And so, because Pinochet was a brutal dictator. He hated communists, but pretty much hated, Democratic Republicans too. And so he put the country down as it became a brutal dictatorship, a junta. And so journalists regularly, they called him disappearing. People would disappear. He'd make people disappear and vanish. And if you ask questions about those people, well, then you might vanish too. And so it became, that's just sort of brutal sort of dictatorship. We would never most people it was turn their stomach to think about all the different things that Pinochet did. Like I said later, he goes to Spain for some medical treatment. He's arrested by the Spanish government. He's brought up on charges of murder because he ordered the murder of so many people. And I think they finally convicted him of 5,000 and then stopped at that point. And so he was an old man by this point. And so, but he was not communist. He hated communists, so we supported him. And that became the real problem with containment is you find yourself supporting people that you wouldn't necessarily want to support otherwise, because our foreign policy becomes so fixated on communism that we don't really take into consideration a lot of other things. All we ask is, are they communist? And, well, no, hey, well, then we'll support you on all this. And so we become very myopic or short-sighted as a result of that. This is also going to lead to the United States' first big after World War II military engagement, which is the Korean War. Korea as a nation had been separated into a North Korea and a South Korea as part of the end of World War II. And North Korea, there was a leader there. His last name was Kim, and he had supposedly been born on this sacred mountain and came down from the mountain to fight the Japanese. And then he established a communist Northern Korea. And then the South, we had a government that was a fledgling democracy. And so at some point, I think it's Kim Un, decides he's going to reunite Korea. And so he and his communist countrymen, his army invade South Korea. Now, this catches everybody completely by surprise. They were not expecting this. And so what ends up happening is that people are forced almost completely off the peninsula. And just when you think that it's going to be a victory for the communists, General MacArthur shows up and he gets a little creative. Instead of fighting them, normally you have, here's all this territory that's been taken, and normally you start fighting back and pushing your way up. He says, forget that. I'm going to go over here to the far north, and I'm going to attack them from behind. And it works. All of a sudden, they're able to break out of the Incheon corner pocket, and they're starting to have a lot of success, and they're pushing the communists all the way back up to the north, and they push them right up to the Chinese border. And then the Chinese get involved because the Chinese were a communist country by this time, and they were uncomfortable with having a United States military or a United Nations military so close to their border, and they felt like they needed to prop up the North Korea, which they still do to this day. And so they send 2 million soldiers over the North Korean border. And they're going to push the American armies and the Allied armies all the way back to the 38th parallel, which is still the border today. And so all of this happens in like a 6-month period. There's massive conflict. There's huge fatalities. Something like 58,000 Americans are going to die. And then we get back to where we started from. And basically for the next 3 years, the dividing line doesn't really move much. The front is still the same line as now. It's called the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And there is a table right there in the middle of the DMZ with a line down the middle so the North Koreans and the South Koreans can continue to have a place to talk to each other. The United States, and Korea is still a communist country, although it's hard to say if they're a communist or a dictatorship or a communist dictatorship or whatever, because Kim Un his son will, eventually take over when Kim dies, and then that Kim will die of old age. Now we have the current Kim Jong-un that is in charge of North Korea, and so you have this dynasty, which is probably not very communist, but then they run their country as this command economy, sort of this communist mentality. And another place we're going to see this is going to be in Vietnam. And so But anyway, so Vietnam, what's going to happen in Vietnam is you're going to have Ho Chi Minh, former history teacher. Watch out for history teachers; they get you in trouble. You have this former history teacher who, once again, Vietnam is divided between a north and a south, but the north is much more prosperous. The north is much larger population, and they are communist. They are largely under the sway of Ho Chi Minh, who's a nationalist more than he is a communist, but he's a nationalist. And so we were afraid that because there's going to be this election, this big election, what kind of government we're going to have. And so there was a fear that the North, having such a high population, would be able to outvote the South and install a communist presidency or a communist government. And so we couldn't let that happen. And so that's how we get involved in the Vietnam War. Oftentimes we talk about North Vietnam and South Vietnam, but the reality is there were no two Vietnams. It was a civil war that the United States gets involved in just because we're trying to contain communism. We got to make sure we don't have that domino effect. If communists take over in Vietnam, well, then Cambodia may fall, and then Thailand, and then eventually maybe Burma, now Myanmar, and then India, which is the second most populous country in the world. Or maybe it's going to spread south and maybe even get so far as Australia after going through Malaysia. I mean, there's this real fear of communism and spreading through this domino effect. So we have to contain it. So as a result, in Korea, we're willing to sacrifice over 50,000 soldiers to basically get us back to where we started from. And then we were able to declare, you know what, we did our part, we contained communism. Communists never made it across the line again. And whereas Vietnam, of course, we are going to ultimately lose that because the Vietnamese just absolutely refuse to accept that they've lost the war. In their mind, it didn't matter how many people they lost, they were going to keep fighting, and the United States was an aggressive invader. And so they were able to marshal a lot of nationalism to basically continue fighting, even though they lost like 10 times as many soldiers. We still lost 56,000 men and women in Vietnam, and they lost 10 times that. And so actually, I think the one number I read is they may have lost as many as 3.5 million people during the war. And but they were on their home country, and that nationalism, never underestimate how powerful patriotism and nationalism are. And so we failed to contain communism there. Interestingly enough, by the way, the North Vietnamese, at the same time that they were fighting us, were also fighting the communist China. And then later had to go to war with the communist Cambodia. So apparently communists are not always on the same side. We just didn't realize that at the time. So anyway, so containment, that became became our goal in the early parts of the Cold War. Eventually, in the 1970s, we're going to change gears from containment to détente, or engagement, where we actually start talking to each other in the ideas of maybe trying to reduce some of the tensions and maybe even signing some arms limitation treaties. Maybe start working together on a space program. Maybe start working together on tracking hurricanes in the Caribbean. Some just different things like this to kind of thaw out this Cold War before something dangerous happened, and before something that happened that couldn't be undone happened. So, all right. So, containment, Truman Doctrine, really written by General Marshall, though. So, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.